Yeah, thanks everyone. Before I get started with the talk, environmental frameworks with Vite and React, I just want to give a quick shout out to Taylor Otwell and the Laravel crew. It's funny how time flies. 10 years ago, I was at LaraCon in Kentucky, and today Taylor is here talking about the future of the web, building websites with Laravel. So pretty cool to see, full circle. So this isn't a comprehensive list, and by the time you see this, there may be another framework that's already built on Vite, and for good reason. My name is Brandon Roberts. You can follow me on Twitter at Brandon T. Roberts, or I tweet out GIFs. I talk about sports. I block people sometimes, but that's just what you got to do. As I mentioned before, I'm the creator of AnalogJS, also a maintainer on the NgRx project, Google developer expert and an NX champion. Shout out to NX, big sponsor of the conference. And I also work as a principal engineer at Dick's Sporting Goods. No, I cannot give you a discount, but I hope that you do have a good experience. But we do help athletes on their sports journey there. So for this talk, I'm going to talk about Vite, of course, because Vite is where it's at these days. I'll talk about Vite plugins, and also talk about environments, which is something new to Vite. So Vite itself, of course, has blown up since it's first started getting developed. So I want to just talk some about the things that they wanted to, goals that they wanted to solve in general with Vite project and where we were and kind of where we're going. So some of the problems that Vite intended to solve are slow server starts in development compared to like other projects. Also, instead of using Bono-based development, it dynamically uses files using browser APIs. So it's unbundled in that way. And this became really important because of ES modules and the progression of their technology being more important in the browser experience. But overall, in intending to improve the developer experience, we're building for the web, of course. And we just had a panel about the future and building for the web and open source, so falls right in line with that. So some of Vite's features include instant server start, HMR or hot module replacement. Also has great developer experience out of the box, fast builds, extensibility of plugins, and of course with the React ecosystem, they have a first-party React plugin, and then TypeScript support out of the box. So that's just a quick overview of Vite, the project. I know, like I said, a lot of you may use Vite or have come across it, so, but for those who haven't, just wanted to kind of cover that part of it. So next, I'll talk about Vite plugins. Vite plugins they're built on top of the Rollup plugin API, which Rollup has been around for a long time also. There have been some developments around Rollup, or Rolldown, I should say, to bring another experience to Vite internally. They also have internal plugins that Vite uses to do many things to when you're building an application, such as handle CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. Then there's also room for custom plugins. And this is where a lot of the power of Vite comes into place. So these plugins allow you to do things like resolve modules, where you can define how those things are loaded in. Transform existing code. One big thing is React Refresh, for example. That's something that you can transform code with a plugin to do, and that's been implemented, of course, in the React plugin. Hot module replacement is something that can be connected to a plugin. You can kind of control that experience, and from a plugin's perspective, you can use that in a plugin to achieve a particular task. You can also collect metadata. I mentioned projects like TanStack. They do things like use these plugins to collect metadata, to build things like a manifest, so that when you're using things like server functions or API routes in a project like that, it uses those plugins to collect that. And of course, it also bundles code, ships that to production, which, like I said, it just come out of the box for a bundler or build tool. There are many different frameworks out there that are built on top of Vite. I remember Astro was one of probably the first major ones that kind of migrated to like their custom solution to Vite. Also a project like SpellKit, also Remix, which was using its own custom toolchain before, which Remix or React Router moved to using that as a Vite plugin. Also mentioned TanStack, which has its own toolchain there that's taking advantage of that too. And of course, there are other projects that take advantage of or use this plugin architecture to create a framework, kind of a framework in a box. So this is an example of a simple plugin where you can look for a JSX file, modify some code, and return that code. And you can kind of compose these in a pipeline to transform or build an application or achieve some of the other things that I mentioned earlier. You can also do things like I mentioned, configure the dev server, control HMR. These kind of build up an architecture that you have with Vite. And so there are two main runtimes that you have with when you're building applications with Vite. There's the client runtime, or just the browser runtime, and the SSR, or server runtime. And these are two, like I said, two of the primary ways that Vite kind of works today before we get into the environment conversation later. And I mentioned before, these plugins, this is an example of a plugin that can transform some code based on SSR. And this is how Vite was initially architected, where it supported these two runtimes. So in a particular plugin, you can check to see if they're building for an SSR app, and perform some code there that only needs to be handled in that scenario, versus on the browser where you may want to just take advantage of those browser APIs, or things like dead code elimination or other features like that. If you want to learn more about the Vite kind of plugin and pipeline, you can take a look at this blog post. It's by Patak, who is a core member on the Vite core team member, and also works at StackBlitz and Bolt.news. So you can check that out. It gave me a lot of insight on how these plugins work today and how you can continue to use those plugins today, and how the overall process works. So that brought us to, with all these plugins and things, it gave a lot of flexibility to these frameworks to be able to build for their particular ecosystem, React being one of them, and depending on, like I said, which React framework you use, built on top of Vite, they take advantage of all these plugins. But there were some things that were kind of across the board that were requested as more framework authors begin to use these plugins for their particular use case. And this brought us to the environment API, and I'll talk about some of the design constraints of how it was initially built, and some of the concepts that came out of these conversations with plugin authors, framework authors, and providers also. Before I get into that, I did want to give a quick shout out to the Vite project, which it was inspired by Bun's router API, and took on some of these ideas in the beginning, which they used like a forked version of Nitro and H3, which Nitro is like a server engine toolkit that's used there. And it provided a way to kind of orchestrate these multiple builds in a way that kind of parallel with how Vite built projects but allow you to build these different targets for client applications, server applications, SSR, or even static assets. And Vite was one of the projects that powered TAN-Stack Start and also Solid Start in the beginning, but they've eventually moved to more of a standard Vite plugin API, which this kind of ties into the environments that we'll talk about here soon. So we talked about the design constraints, or I want to talk about design constraints and concepts. And some of the things that I mentioned before, you have these two runtimes that you're using Vite for building a client application and a server application. So you have these like separate commands that you have to do to do that. So in order to build these two different runtimes, you have a Vite build and a Vite build SSR. So some of the framework authors took different approaches in how you would integrate this. Some would just say, just run these two commands, and someone wanted it to be a little more seamless. And that brought me to like these framework specific implementations. And I ran into this also building a meta framework that took advantage of Vite. And when trying to build these client and server runtimes as part of the same process, I looked around and looked at these other frameworks and saw what they were doing on top of that. And I saw something similar to here where you're taking in the Vite config, you're passing in some build options, and you're calling build for this SSR app. So it's open source. I looked at this code. I was like, okay, works for me. I took this, plugged it into my own project. And then you end up kind of with a plugin that looks something like this. So you have to use this particular closed bundle hook. This tells you that the client application is already built. And then you await that, and you make sure that you don't build it again if you're building the SSR app, so that you get more of a seamless experience there. So this was one of those things that a lot of the framework authors, including myself, were looking at the Vite team to come up with a solution for. And also, like I said, we wanted a reusable foundation that we could all share and build upon. There's also, in the Vite process today, they have isolated plugins. So when you're building for a client or you're building for the server, there wasn't a cohesive way to connect these two. So if you look at an example of how you would server-side render an application, just using Vite as the build tool itself, you're still kind of constrained between this client and server concepts. And the last thing was these different runtimes. So just building of course, Node is probably the most popular one out there, but of course there's still other runtimes that have come along. Like I mentioned before, we have the browser runtime, we have the Node runtime or server runtime, but there are also other runtimes that we want to take advantage of, or environments, such as Cloudflare workers, using the Vitesse.js DOM, Workerd platform, or even future runtimes that they want to build with Vite. So this brought the Vite team looked at this landscape of the web and how the Vite was being used, and went back to the design board, had a lot of sessions, and come up with the environment API. And what that came up with, or what came out of that, was a single command for an application build. Now, you could consider a client app or a client build an application, but this was to span across multiple runtimes or environments in this case. There's also framework agnostic implementations there that we could take advantage of. And like I was mentioning, we wanted a standardized API where we didn't have to do framework-specific things in each one of these projects, but could still build on the foundation of Vite. and also take advantage of some of these shared plugins and support these some of the different runtimes. So looking at this, this is just like a standard Vite config. It doesn't have, you could have plugins right here, but it's just an example of what this will look like today without any environments configured. But introducing this new API allows us to declaratively define these different environments. So in this case, I have a client environment, which this one is included by default. You could also have an SSR environment. SSR is not specific. It does have that for backward compatibility. But even new paradigms like React Server components, it has a paradigm that has its own set of sort of bundling requirements. So you could declare these environments that you could use in development and in production. So we want to shorten that gap between the dev and build environments. It also gives us more context on what you're targeting there. So before we just had client and SSR, then you can define your own custom environments, whether it be SSR, server. I've had a mix and match of both, kind of working on different projects. So you can also access these environments in your server code. In this case, I'm just using the client environment where I want to transform a particular request. If this was server-side rendering, I can set up an SSR environment. So it provides much more flexibility. And looking at this chart here, it kind of mentioned what I had before. We still want to have a single dev server that can talk across these different environments and be able to communicate and still take advantage of these different platforms and things that you want to build today. And so by defining these new environments, they also introduced a new builder API that gives you access to these environments that you can use when you run a build to continue to, or you map these environments, you can iterate over them and build them in parallel or also do some more work. Like I mentioned before, I would build a client application, a server app, or SSR rendering, and then a server app. So with this new environment API, it opens up that more flexibility there. So you can still wrap all these environments in a particular plugin. I'm just using, of course, React Miami as an example. But you could have a framework that defines these environments and still wrap that in a single plugin. And you may be consuming these environment-style plugins today as the framework authors have used these APIs and implemented them in their projects. And we get back to the thing that we were targeting before, which was a single Vite build command that could span across these different environments. And there was a lot of refactoring and work they had to do under the hood to support this. One of those things was the module graphs. A module graph is a way that it knows what files exist, how the dependencies are handled together. And this was a mixed module graph between client and server. But now they have, and this also you had to embed this logic into your plugins before. But now these different graphs for these different environments are isolated so you can have more precision with these plugins. It also opened up to where you can define custom environments. I mentioned React Server components as an environment. There's also one that's included, the runnable dev environment, where it's built on top of the fetch API, which just takes a standard request and response. So if you just want to build something lightweight, you could build use one of these custom environments or even build your own as a plugin. And I talked about Workerd as an environment that you can target, and you can use this to build where you could have runtime agnostic SSR, whether you're targeting Node or something like Cloudflare or serverless or including serverless or these other deployment targets. And it introduced new APIs that gave us per environment plugins. Like I mentioned, you can use these to transform code in these specific places. and then have those plugins share the same context so we're not like isolated when doing the builds. And this gives us, like I said, it shortens that gap between the dev and prod developer experience, whether you're a plugin author or a framework author. And of course, they made the environment API backward compatible. So even if you're just using client SSR today, you can use these APIs under the hood without many breaking changes today. But they're still working on these, like ironing these APIs out. So this is an example of just a per environment plugin and some of these helper functions are provided by Vite that you can use to target a plugin for a specific environment for backwards compatibility if you want to, like I said, only apply that in certain cases. So what does this mean for frameworks and meta frameworks? We already mentioned these have these support for separate runtimes. Also have more of a unified API that you can use to build with Vite across these different platforms. Less framework-specific code. I mean, I was able to use this and even delete some of the code that I had to support these different builds and be able to support these different more environments in the future. There's also runtime providers that build on top of this Vite environment API. One example of those was Cloudflare, where Cloudflare uses their workers platform that you can use in development and production. Because previously you would develop it sort of as a node app, or they would give you these bindings that you could develop, that you could connect to locally. But now they've created a first-party Vite plugin that lets you build those as an integrated experience. So there's less difference between development and deploying to production. And there's opportunities for Vercel to take advantage of these plugins also. They have integrations with Remix already, which is built on top of, the Remix plugin is built on top of Vite. And even Nitro is looking at using the environment API, because Nitro already deploys or has a framework agnostic core to support many different deployment providers. So what's next for the environment API? Well, the environment API is experimental in Vite 6. They are continuing to work on those APIs and getting more feedback for the usage for, like I said, plugin authors, framework authors, and also these deployment provider plugins becoming more available that we can take advantage of. And stabilization coming in Vite 7, with hopefully there will be only minor breaking changes there. If you'd like to look at an example of a plugin that uses, mentioned before about Nitro, I maintain a plugin that uses Vite and Nitro and uses the environment API with React that you can take a look at that GitHub repo and see how that works together. So to recap, talked about Vite, talked about Vite plugins, kind of where the plugins stand today, how the Vite build architecture works today, and talked about the Vite environment API. And like I mentioned before, they're looking forward to see how the Vite and React ecosystem continue to evolve with these new APIs, and unlocking more opportunities and things for developers. I'd like to thank the React Miami team for having me. Thank you for listening to this talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.